Good afternoon. We are here at the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia, celebrating Housing Opportunities Made Equal of Virginia's 50th anniversary. Welcome. My name is Monica Jefferson, and I am currently serving as the interim president, chief executive officer of Housing Opportunities Made Equal of Virginia, also known as HOME. Over the next 6 weeks, we will take you on a journey as we discuss 50 years of fair housing, 50 years of ensuring equal access to housing, 50 years of battling divisive housing practices, and 50 years of confronting housing-related inequities on a systemic level. Today, I will be joined with members of HOME's family from the past and staff from the present. And we're going to talk about the challenges and the root cause of inequality facing many individuals here in Virginia. I'm delighted that we are streaming live from HOME's exhibition here at the Black History Museum. This exhibition will be held through April the 15th, so that's tax day, so people should not forget that. And if you are joining us virtually, you should have received a digital version of the exhibit. But we are encouraging and hoping that everyone would come down to Lee Street and see it for yourself, as well as spend time in this magnificent museum that is cultured in a lot of rich history. At this time, I want to introduce to you Marlon Buckner. He is the interim director of the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia, and he has been a gracious host to have this exhibit and this conversation series. Welcome, Marlon. It's nice to see you again.
Thank you, Monica. I'm delighted to be here. It's great to see you again, and welcome.
Yes,
Welcome everyone in our audience here at the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia, and to those of you at home, not just across the Commonwealth, not just across the nation, but indeed around the world. We are streaming live, and we are delighted that you're here to join us in what is an absolutely vital conversation. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't begin with a thank you, a series of thank yous. First, a thank you to our extraordinary staff, our team members who do a wonderful job of making sure that all of the rich resources of our organization are available to folks that come to us here at our Lee Street location. I also very much want to thank you, Monica, for giving us the opportunity to participate in this partnership. This is, I think, a great example of the ways in which mission-aligned organizations such as ours can work together to really open the doors of opportunity to have conversations across a range of subject areas. And I think today is I think, the kickoff to a series of conversations that are absolutely essential to understanding where, not just where we've come from, but where we're headed.
Yes.
And when I think about this exhibition, I recognize that behind all of these materials are the stories of people and of families and of communities. Yeah. The stories of people, families, and communities that have been challenged, that have been dispossessed, that have, if you look out our window here, bulldozed out of their homes. We have a legacy of public policy, unique and extraordinary in its ability to decapitalize communities. And that, I think, is something that we mustn't ever lose sight of. Part of the reason that we wanted to partner with HOME in bringing this story inside our four walls is so that we could, through the series of conversations that you're going to have over the course of the next few weeks, be able to take the lessons that we're going to learn inside our four walls, outside our four walls. We want to be able to ensure that these conversations aren't just discussions, but that they actually have meaningful ramifications in our communities, not just in Jackson Ward, not just in Richmond Metro, but indeed across the entire Commonwealth. I'm really excited for this partnership. I'm excited for the session today. And for the subsequent sessions that we'll be hosting here, I want to again invite everyone to please come visit the museum, our exhibit. And once again, Monica, thank you so very much for inviting us to be a partner with Home in this extraordinary and very important work.
Thank you again, Marlon. It is absolutely our pleasure to be here with you in this historic location, partnering with two nonprofit organizations who are trying to move the needle forward so that everyone can have a better quality of life. So thank you so much. We look forward to spending the next month and a half having this wonderful conversation and continuing this conversation hopefully throughout the year. So thank you again.
Thank you.
So for those who are joining us virtually, this exhibition is going to really help us showcase the actions and events that led up to the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But it's also going to highlight a lot of key victories that Home was involved in to really focus on desegregation and the lasting impact that that is having not only here in Virginia, but across the nation. I want to share a few brief housekeeping tips before we begin our conversation today. Today's program is being recorded and will be uploaded on Home's website tomorrow. Virtual attendees are encouraged to use the chat feature in today's presentation and are reminded that all messages, including private ones, are recorded. There will be an opportunity at the end of today's program where we will have some questions posed to all of our speakers. We may not be able to get to all of your questions, but feel free to send them in the chat and we will try our best to answer them. These celebratory events would not be possible without the generous contributions of several sponsors. I want to highlight today our Platinum 50th anniversary sponsors: Wells Fargo Bank, the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development, and Virginia Housing. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time and who may not be familiar with Home's rich history, let me take a few moments and share with you a little bit about our organization. Home was birthed out of the necessity to enforce the Fair Housing Act of 1968. We have continued over the last 5 decades defending the rights of individuals across the Commonwealth of Virginia by tackling divisive housing practices through fair housing enforcement, research, statewide policy, advocacy, and providing direct services of housing counseling and education to many individuals here in the city. Now it is time for us to celebrate a half a century of some transformational work and renewing our commitment of our mission to ensure that everyone has equal access to housing. Home would not exist without the ability to be able to address housing-related systemic inequities that perpetuate segregation, concentrations of poverty, and wealth inequality. Home's current strategic framework has 4 key areas that we will be discussing during our community conversations: our accountability and fair housing, combating segregated housing patterns, closing the Black-white homeownership gap, and supporting Virginia's unstable housing environment. None of these issues are new to Virginia. None of these new issues are new to me or to you or to the communities we serve. Many individuals suffer in silence. That's why Home, along with many other housing advocates, are in the trenches each and every day, advocating for policy change to ensure that everyone has a brighter future. Our vision at Home is to ensure that Virginia becomes a fair state. So again, thank you for being here with us today. Our first topic, which I'm very excited about, is combating segregated housing patterns. Also, we want to specifically talk about residential segregation around race. Residential segregation has a history. It can and will change over time. It hasn't always been as high as the rate as it is now, but residential segregation is the result of some human action that persists even though there's so many racial discriminatory policies in this country. We have the opportunity to change those things. This involves better economic equity. But we can't just rely on economic equity to solve segregation. Instead, we need to face these issues head on and be able to talk about race, talk about racial inclusion, talk about racial inequity, talk about those systemic issues that continue to plague individuals today in 2022. And so our today's conversation is going to start off with some of the lessons from the past. Many of you all should be familiar, if you've been in Richmond, Virginia over the last couple of decades, that Home won one of the largest systemic victories in the country. It was our case, Home versus Nationwide Insurance in 1996. Home challenged the radical and racial discriminatory practices of one of the largest homeowners insurance companies in the industry. They were redlining African-American neighborhoods right here in Richmond. Redlining is the discriminatory practice by which insurance companies, mortgage lenders, banks deny residents in their communities based upon racial or ethnic composition. During Home versus Nationwide, Home was represented by an outstanding group of lawyers led by our first guest today, Tom Wolfe. Tom has been an advocate for home and fair housing for years. I am so glad that he is here today to share with us and give us insight how they were able to win this case. Let's welcome Tom Wolfe.
Thank you, Monica. Take my mask off
Yes.
here. I am delighted to be here today to talk about. Oh, I got to put my mic on. There we go.
Okay.
I'm delighted to be here today to talk about my favorite case in my 44-year career as a trial lawyer. It was in 1998, and my partner, who I had recruited into my law firm, Tim Kane, had been very active on Home's board. I think he may have even been the chair of the board, but was very supportive of Home. I kind of knew about Home a little bit, but was not active with it. I had the great good fortune to see the resume of a brand new lawyer from Houston, an African-American who had graduated from West Point and served in the Army. And within literally 3 minutes of seeing her resume cross my desk, I called her up and told her I knew that she was moving to Richmond because her husband had gotten a job here. I said, you just have to promise me that you won't take a job from anybody else until you meet with us, because this is the place for you and you are exactly who we're looking for.
Yeah.
And was that ever true?
Absolutely.
That was Rhonda Harmon.
The
who-
late, great Rhonda
Who
Harmon.
tragically passed away just very recently, this year.
Well, Tom, before we begin today, I would love to tell everybody about this fair housing hero that's sitting next to me. Tom Wolfe is the managing partner for the Richmond office of the law firm Miles and Stockbridge. He's a longtime supporter of Home. In 1998, as he stated, he was a senior member of the trial team that not only included Rhonda Harmon, but also Senator Kane. Together, they represented Home in a landmark fair housing case against Nationwide Insurance. Tom is quick to point out that Tim and Rhonda were the stars of the show, not him, but he was an executive producer and a supporting actor. Tom has been involved in a number of landmark cases and was recently named to the Virginia Lawyers Hall of Fame. He thoroughly enjoys practicing law. So Tom, I want to start our conversation today with the first question that's probably on everyone's mind. Again, in the late 90s, you were involved in one of the most pivotal cases from Home's history. Can you tell us a little bit about why your firm was chosen at the time, how they became involved with Home, and why you thought this case was so important?
Well, as I mentioned, Tim had been very active in Home. He was the mayor at the time that this all unfurled. And he spoke with Connie Chamberlain about the anecdotal evidence of redlining by homeowners insurance companies in Richmond. It was kind of hard to pin it down, but there were a lot of stories about in the community of people having a hard time getting homeowners insurance. And as you know, if you can't get homeowners insurance, you can't buy a house at most places, right? So it is critical. And so Tim worked with Connie and our fairly new associate at the time, Rhonda Harmon, to help set up testing and do some investigation. And it seemed like most of the insurance companies were probably discriminating, but very hard to prove it. The testing showed that the worst offender was Nationwide Insurance. Not on everybody's side. But this case changed changed the way they did business, really. So we thought that we would show the other side the testing, and that they would say, oh, okay, we'll make some changes and pay you some money. But they were just adamant. They had a law firm out of Chicago that was just adamant to make this a scorched earth litigation matter and force Home to spend a ton of money. They weren't paying their lawyers. They were paying for transcripts and travel to take depositions and copying thousands and thousands of documents and for expert witnesses. And so we, at the end of 2 years of reviewing documents from Nationwide and taking depositions of their people, we thought we had a good case.
Yeah.
No one of these cases had ever gone to trial in the United States. A redlining case against an insurance company. And on the eve of trial, I remember it was Columbus Day. The judge, even though the court was closed, the judge, Randy Johnson, fabulous trial judge from Richmond, called the parties into his chambers and said, you got to settle this case. And he twisted our arms and got Connie to agree that we would take $3 million. And Nationwide offered us $200,000, which was just the out-of-pocket expenses that Home had spent on the case. So we didn't have any choice. We were going to go to trial. And every one of our witnesses was great. The testers all testified. They were wonderful. Connie testified. She was great. It just could not have gone better. And even at the end of the trial, Nationwide did not get it. They did not see what everybody on the jury had seen, and which we were convinced of, that you may not have a written policy that says we don't want to sell homeowners insurance to Black people, but in effect, that's what you're doing, because you've pulled all your agents out of the city of Richmond and put them in the suburbs. You really discourage your Black agents from trying to sell homeowners insurance
Mhm.
in the city to their friends, to people they know, to neighborhoods they know. One of the telling things in the trial, I was cross-examining the district supervisor for this area. And I said, so like, do you try to sell insurance in Highland Park? And he said, I don't know where Highland Park is. I said, well, okay, do you try to sell insurance in Battery Park? I don't know where Battery Park is.
Mm.
They had moved the headquarters out to Bon Air. I said, when you moved the headquarters out there, did you look out the window of your car as you're driving around and notice that it's kind of a different population from the office that you had downtown Richmond? I don't know what you mean. Do you notice that all the people you're passing out there at that time are white? I don't see color. Well, your policies of who you sell to, who you target, that's what they said, who is our target market. It just happens that all those folks, all those neighborhoods are very, very heavily white. And using your own criteria of education and income that they say that's how we choose our target markets. One of your best markets would be in Ginner Park, Richmond. But you scratch that from your list, noting that it has a higher than average minority population. Why would you say that? And even at the end of the trial, they thought they were going to win. They didn't offer us any money. The judge called us back in the chambers right before the trial was over and said to Nationwide, have you been looking at the jury? They don't like your case. And I think they raised their offer to like $500,000. I mean, it was just ridiculous.
Oh, wow.
So anyway, it was a case that I became passionate about after Tim and Rhonda told me about it. And the verdict was $100.5 million, which at the time was the largest civil rights verdict in history.
That's right,
And it literally changed the insurance industry in the nation.
So, you know, Tom, I think about, we've got this small nonprofit home that Nationwide probably didn't know anything about. We've got the local law office of Missoula and McCandish. And then you've got Nationwide, who had to have at least a fleet of lawyers.
Right.
You know, versus these small organizations here. What was the secret sauce? How did you all win this case?
As one of our paralegals said, we have the dream team. Rhonda was just relentless and examined tens of thousands of documents that Nationwide tried to bury us with in the discovery process. Tim was, it helped that he was the mayor of the city at the time, but I mean, he's just a great trial lawyer. And we just, our team was really just meshed so well with our client and our witnesses, and this law firm from Chicago just really didn't get it. We thought they had a great history of winning fair housing cases around the country, but they did not understand the dynamics of Richmond, Virginia.
Tom, what do you think would have happened if you all lost the case?
So I remember when Tim first talked to me about taking this case, and he said, I think that the amount of attorney time in it would probably be something like $200,000 to $250,000. By the end of the 2 years, it was over $2 million of attorney time that we had put into it.
Those are a lot of billable hours.
That was, I mean, a lot of billable hours so I was concerned at some point in the case that the firm was investing so much in it. We're a relatively small firm that it was quite possible that we would lose the case.
Right.
And that would be pretty disappointing for several years of income down the drain.
Yeah. And I think
And for home, I would add, $200,000 that they had spent out of pocket was huge. I mean, that was an enormous part of their budget at the time.
So it would have been financially devastating for home, for the law firm. But I think the big issue is that Nationwide would have got away with divisive redlining practices.
Yeah, so talking about their size, they had, I think their net worth was over $10 billion at the time. And so I figured out that if you laid dollar bills end to end, 10 billion of them would go, I said, you think that would go to as far as Washington, D.C., as far as New York, as far as Paris, as far as Tokyo? How about around the world? None of those come close. It would go to the moon and back a couple of times.
Yeah.
That's $10 billion.
Right.
So the jury awarded $100 million in punitive damages. Do you want me to talk about the appeal?
Yeah. Yes, we've got time.
So on the appeal, Connie and Tim were just true believers and thought that this was destiny, that the Supreme Court of Virginia was going to uphold this $100.5 million verdict. And again, it was $100 million in punitive damages, $500,000 in compensatory damages, which was to compensate home for the resources that it had to spend to defend the statute of fair housing in Virginia. I was a skeptic. I said, those white suburbanites on our Virginia Supreme Court are never going to believe that race discrimination could possibly be worth $100 million. Just not going to happen. So it turned out it was even worse than I expected, because I thought they were just going to cut down the award of damages, punitive damages, but they did worse than that. They said, oh, home never had standing to bring this case. Court didn't have jurisdiction of the case because home didn't have standing, meaning that their rationale was, well, home wasn't really trying to buy insurance. The testers weren't trying to buy insurance, so there's no damage. And since there's no damage, there's no standing, you're just kicked out of court and you get zero. So that was a kind of a disappointing day when we read that opinion in the Supreme Court clerk's office. I remember standing next to Tim and we're just like, what? And the reason that was so ridiculous is that case right back there, the Havens case, established for the federal statute that testers do have standing.
Yes.
That home had standing.
Organizational standing.
Right?
Yes.
Because that's what is required. If you don't have that, how are you going to enforce the statute?
Exactly.
And our Virginia Supreme Court said, well, our statute is not a federal statute. It was almost identically written, but said that under Virginia law, you don't have standing. So we filed a petition to rehear the appeal which is granted like 1 in 10,000 at that time probably, and the court granted the petition for rehearing. In the meantime, one of the most reactionary justices on the Supreme Court retired and went off the court, and a much more progressive justice came on the court. So the decision against us was 4-3. There's 7 justices on the court. We lost by 1 vote.
Wow.
Now one of those votes is off and a new vote comes on. And so at 2 o'clock in the morning, on the day we were supposed to re-argue the case before the Virginia Supreme Court, we settled it. And we settled for $22.5 million, $5 million of which went to the National Fair Housing Alliance, and $17.5 million for home.
Yes. Well, Tom, I know everyone in this room and online is so thankful and appreciative of your efforts. Senator Tim Kaine, Rhonda Harmon, and he mentioned Connie Chamberlain was the president and chief executive officer at that time. And so we're so thankful for all of you all's hard work and endeavors to bring about this largest civil rights verdict. And it was definitely a victory for home.
And I got to say that Susan Scoville was absolutely instrumental in the strategy for the whole thing. She was great. I was very, very privileged to be a part of that case, and to know that today it still has an impact.
Yes.
And without an organization like Home, those practices would be rampant and people wouldn't even worry about being held accountable.
Yeah. And so it's so important. Home is needed to be the leading mobilizing force in fair housing and housing discrimination. Now, I know that there was another case that you helped us with, and this was an interesting case. Let's see if people remember this. You represented Home with a client by the name of Neely Pitts in Pitts versus Matthews in 2006. Can you tell us a little bit about the significance of that case?
So this was in Chesterfield County, and there was a guy who somehow got on the news who was stating proudly that there would be no, and he used the N-word, in his neighborhood, that he had a restrictive covenant in his deed, and as long as he was living there, there wouldn't be any of these people. And then they were like, what? I mean, I forget which station ran him ranting like that. But once that had happened and everybody had seen it on TV, then what are you going to do? Just ignore it? I mean, the guy was a little, he had some mental issues, I think, but clearly just a dyed-in-the-wool racist who thought nothing of saying what he said. Well, so we couldn't let that go unnoticed and filed a suit against him, and tried the case and won it in Chesterfield County, which was less diverse at the time than it is now. And it was really just making a statement that you can't do this if you are publicly saying something like that. You can think whatever you want to, but when you start trying to say that to actively discourage Blacks from moving into your neighborhood, that can't be. So it was important to bring that case.
So, Tom, knowing that racist deed restrictions and restricted covenants are clearly illegal and has been for over 75 years now, how do you think we still manage to exist, how they still manage to exist today, and what can we do about them?
So, the restrictive covenants in deeds have no legal effect.
Right.
Because it's been illegal since the 40s.
Right.
But usually, I think good lawyers just don't copy that over in deeds when they're creating a deed to go to a new buyer. I really haven't seen one of those for a while, although I saw it when I bought my house in Deer Park in 1980. But just the fact of having a deed in a public record that has that racist language in it is really offensive. And so it's something that the General Assembly could do something about.
Yes.
Probably not their top priority this session, I would say.
Okay. Thank you so much. We may have time to take one question from our audience here in the exhibit. Does anyone have any questions for Tom before we wrap things up? Yes.
Yes, I just have one about the nationwide case.
Yeah.
You did mention that the Black agents have been encouraged basically not to sell products in Black neighborhoods. And I'm just wondering, like, in a case where obviously you're going after an institution, how does the behavior of like individuals factor in, right? Because obviously they were doing their jobs and what they were told, but they were complicit in what Nationwide was doing. So I'm just curious about that.
Right. Well, some of them quit and testified for us.
Oh.
Right. So, but others, they're trying to make a living, and Nationwide is saying, you just got to focus on the target markets where you have been selling historically is not our target market. If you want to make any money, you got to focus on the target markets. And so it's a tough choice for any employee when they are being asked to do something that they can see is racist, but their employer, Nationwide would have passed, their people would have passed a polygraph test that they were not racist, right? That what they were doing was not racist. They didn't intend to discriminate against anybody. As they said, money's money. We don't care who it comes from, right? But they really do. Their words are one thing, and that was the difficulty. This is why none of these cases had gone to trial. You don't find a memo that says we discriminate against Black people, right? It's all circumstantial evidence. But there are brave employees like the people who quit and said, I'm not going to be a part of this, and came forward and testified for us.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Tom. Join me in thanking him for being here with us today. And this has been a great conversation, giving us insight on how the Dream Team, as you said, defeated an insurance giant like Nationwide. So again, but most importantly, I think that came out of this is the need to continue to unravel housing segregation. So thank you so much for being here. This has been a great discussion, our lessons from the past, and we thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Monica.
One more time for Tom Wolf. And so we've had a great dialogue today about our lessons from the past. And now we're going to switch gears and talk about our vision for the future. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce some of the greatest talent that we have at home. I would like to welcome Bryan Moorefield, who is our Director of Research and Policy, along with Isabel McLean. She is a research policy and analyst. And they're going to present a presentation today around segregation. So,
right. Thank you, Monica. Thanks, everyone. I'm Bryan. That's Isabel. So I'm speaking today about residential segregation by race. In this sense, segregation is when racial demographics of neighborhoods look very different from the racial demographics of the broader region to which those neighborhoods belong. Put more simply, it's when racial groups tend to live in separate neighborhoods. Absolutely. So I'll be focusing on the segregation of Black residents from white residents. There has been other forms of segregation, certainly, but the reason for this focus is because socioeconomic opportunities tend to be concentrated in predominantly white neighborhoods, and because Black-white segregation has been more persistent and severe than other forms of residential segregation by race or ethnicity in this country. So the Richmond area shows a pattern of residential segregation by race. So just to visualize what I'm talking about when I'm mentioning demographic differences here, what I've done is plotted Richmond census tracts, which we can think of as neighborhoods, according to the percentage of the population there that's Black. The orange line here represents the percentage of Black residents among the overall metropolitan statistical area, which is just shy of 30%. But what you can see is that we have quite a variety among the different census tracts. If the Richmond area were not segregated to any significant extent, we would see those dots clustered around the orange line. If it were absolutely segregated to the greatest possible extent, we would see these dots spread out at the far ends of the chart.
It's difficult. All right. So as I was saying, I created a map of Richmond that includes Richmond City, Henrico, and Chesterfield counties based on data from 2019. This is more specific than what Brian was speaking to, since it just includes these 3 counties. So in total, 32% of residents in these 3 counties identified as Black or African American, and this number includes both Hispanic and non-Hispanic ethnicities, while 53% identified as white non-Hispanic. So in order to show the level of racial segregation throughout this whole area of the 3 counties, I compared these total percentages to the percentage of white and Black residents in each census tract on the smaller level. So like Brian explained regarding the chart that he showed, if this area had absolutely no segregated housing patterns across the board, then the racial composition of the whole would match each of the individual census tracts. However, as you can see, for many of the tracts, that is very much not the case. So on the map, the areas that are blue are disproportionately white, meaning that the percentage of white residents in these tracts is higher than 53%, the total percentage of white residents across the board in all 3 counties. This disproportionality increases as the blue becomes darker. And the red color in the map shows the disproportionality of Black residents in a similar manner. So for example, the census tracts with the darkest red color here have 75% or more Black residents in those census tracts than they would if it matched the entire area's ratio of Black to white residents. There are some gray tracts here that are not severely disproportionate and thus not severely segregated, but unfortunately, the map here indicates that the majority of census tracts in these 3 counties have a significant degree of racial segregation.
So basic point is segregation is harmful. It limits individual housing choice. Another point is that racial segregation is not the result of Black self-segregation. Survey data indicate that Black home seekers would in fact prefer to live in diverse neighborhoods, but barriers prevent them from doing so. Segregation also disadvantages predominantly Black neighborhoods in material ways compared to comparable predominantly white neighborhoods. Predominantly Black neighborhoods see poorer outcomes in terms of housing quality, home values, home ownership rates, housing stability, schools, other public services, crime rates, access to financial services, access to employment, commercial opportunities, and health outcomes, among others. At the risk of stating the obvious, these disparities are not caused by race. Predominantly Black neighborhoods are not worse off because they are predominantly Black. Rather, many of the most significant services, amenities, and opportunities in our society are place-based. Residential segregation allows this place-based allocation of resources to map racial injustice onto neighborhood geographies while amplifying those injustices through isolation. What Dr. Andre Perry and associates call place-based discrimination in a recent report about Richmond by the Brookings Institute. Residential segregation also makes it more difficult to address these inequities through public policy because political representation is place-based. Segregation hinders cross-racial political solidarity because place-based benefits for predominantly Black neighborhoods do not immediately benefit most white residents who live elsewhere. A point that was brought up earlier is that American neighborhoods were not always segregated to the extent seen in the 20th and 21st centuries. In the book American Apartheid, sociologists Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton write, quote, "Until the end of the 19th century, Blacks and whites were relatively integrated in both northern and southern cities. As late as 1900, the typical Black urbanite still lived in a neighborhood that was predominantly white. The evolution of segregated all-Black neighborhoods occurred later and was not the result of impersonal market forces." Now, of course, residential proximity did not mean social equality in those earlier centuries. Nevertheless, I mention this to make the point that residential segregation in America has a history. It is not a constant. We are not stuck with it by some law of human nature. It can get better or worse, depending on social actions. Residential segregation developed through explicit racially discriminatory public policies and private practices. These include explicit city ordinances requiring segregation, the legal permissibility of discrimination, government recognition of the racially restricted covenants that we heard about earlier, racially segregated public housing sites located in neighborhoods with corresponding racial demographics, redlining by the federal government, which became the basis for discriminatory lending and insurance practices by government and private agencies. In addition, white residents' avoidance of integrating neighborhoods, including in response to blockbusting. And then much of this was backed up by direct intimidation and physical violence of white residents against Black residents. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibited discrimination in housing on the basis of race, among other legally protected classes. But residential segregation continues despite that. Racial disparities in income and wealth explain segregated housing patterns today to some limited extent. On average, white residents have significantly higher levels of wealth and income than Black residents. This has implications for the transmission of knowledge related to housing searches, including financial knowledge. But the main problem with this income and wealth gap is a disparity in purchasing power, and access to credit. The racial disparity in purchasing power and credit means that the average white resident will have more housing options than the average Black resident. And similarly, it means that neighborhoods lacking affordable housing options will disproportionately exclude Black residents, which further perpetuates the racial wealth gap. Moving to such neighborhoods with the lack of affordable housing options and maintaining policies that limit these options provide more affluent white residents with an opportunity to avoid Black neighbors, unfortunately. On the other hand, increasing affordable housing options in affluent, predominantly white neighborhoods is an important method for facilitating desegregation. This can be done through tax credits, tax incentives for the construction and preservation of housing units that are not allowed to be sold or leased above a certain price threshold. This often requires zoning changes that allow for what are often smaller, more dense forms of housing. This frequently inspires political resistance by existing residents, the so-called "not in my backyard" campaigns. And those residents may be motivated by assumptions and prejudices about the unit's occupants as much as about the construction itself. Another way to increase affordable housing opportunities in higher priced neighborhoods is to subsidize the housing budget of lower income residents, allowing them to access homes that would otherwise be out of their price range. A major example being the housing choice voucher. This is most effective when you have prohibitions on source of funds discrimination, as was recently won here in the state of Virginia, in part through homes advocacy. And we are still fighting to make sure that that protection is realized to its fullest possible extent. The housing choice voucher program also is most effective when it's coupled with small area fair market rents rather than metro fair market rents, which helps to ensure that vouchers provide enough money to put rental options in more exclusive neighborhoods within reach of the voucher holder. But income targeted policies are not enough to address residential segregation by race. That segregation is not a simple reflection of disparities in income and wealth. Black-white segregation exists even when wealth and income are held constant. Substantially addressing residential segregation requires a race-conscious approach. Economic incentives can be targeted towards processes that further desegregation in a race-conscious way. But it also requires fighting racial discrimination. It's absolutely key. As I've said, discrimination constrains people's ability to choose among the housing options that they can afford. Housing providers, including real estate agents, assessors, lenders, and insurers, need to be held accountable for discrimination. This includes direct acts of discrimination against individuals, as well as policies that systematically disadvantage groups of people. Unfortunately, our fair housing system in the United States and in Virginia tends to put the burden of that on individuals who have experienced discrimination, which requires a significant amount of knowledge, time, energy, and courage from those people. This kind of reactive enforcement needs to be complemented by a more robust system of proactive audits of housing providers, which will require expanded funding. Homes Fair Housing Department, I believe, will be speaking about their activities in this field in a future week. But I'll mention that we are active in both of those types of enforcement of fair housing rights. And finally, I'll mention that recipients of federal housing funding have a responsibility to affirmatively further fair housing. An explicit goal of that being desegregation, making sure that jurisdictions follow through with their responsibilities there and with their plans to affirmatively further fair housing is essential to that. And it's most effective when it's done on a regional scale. Thank you.
Let's give Brian and Isabel a round of applause. Thank you. We can switch places. Isabel, I think, Brian, you're going to sit tight because you unpacked a lot of great insight about residential segregation. And before we wrap things up, we're just wondering if we had any questions from those who are in the room or those who are joining us virtually. Any questions? Any comments? Let's see if we have any in the chat. Yes.
Brian, do you think we can see from the data and trends that things have been worse?
Nationwide, the trend is that things are getting better, but slowly. And that's not to say that all aspects of housing justice are improving. Home ownership rates are particularly problematic right now. Housing discrimination continues, but in terms of the demographic patterns that I was talking about, there have been gains in terms of that gains in terms of desegregation. Modest.
Just want to check with our tech team and see if we got any questions in the chat. Okay, all right. Well, thank you again, Brian and Isabel. As you can tell, we have an outstanding research and policy team that is working hard in the trenches, dealing with our data, and they've been very active in the General Assembly this session, advocating for Home's legislative and policy agenda. So join me in thanking them again.